I want you to listen to a single sentence. And I want you to pay very, very close attention to what happens physically inside your head as you process the words I'm about to say. Ready?
I'm bracing myself.
Okay, here it is. The horse raced past the barn fell.
Yeah, that is the absolute definition of a cognitive whiplash.
It really is, right? You hear it, and there is this inevitable, uncomfortable half second where your brain just halts. The horse raced past the barn fell.
Exactly. It feels like a glitch in your own hardware.
Yeah, you have to actively go back, rewind the audio in your head and piece it together again.
And what we're going to do today is look at exactly what just happened in that half second of confusion. Because your brain didn't just passively receive a string of words.
Right, it built a blueprint.
It actively built a structural blueprint in real time. The very moment you heard the words, the horse raced, your cognitive architecture automatically committed to a syntactic structure.
It assumed the horse was the subject and raced was the main active verb, right?
Precisely. Your brain decided instantly that the horse was the agent doing the racing, which, is a perfectly reasonable, statistically highly probable commitment.
Yeah, you're happily walking down this mental path, stacking the bricks of the sentence. The horse is racing, it's going past the barn, the visual scene is rendering in your mind's eye.
And everything is totally fine until you crash headfirst into the word fell.
That's where the glitch happens.
Suddenly, the blueprint you built is completely incompatible with the incoming data. A horse that is actively racing past a barn cannot suddenly fell. The syntax breaks.
Because the verb fell needs a subject, but the subject, the horse, is already busy racing.
Exactly. So your parser, your brain's dedicated language processing system, has to trigger an emergency brake. It rapidly backtracks, dismantles the structure it just built, and reanalyzes the entire sentence.
It has to realize that raced wasn't the main active verb at all, right?
Right. It was a reduced relative clause.
So the true meaning, like the hidden architecture of the sentence, is actually the horse that was raced past the barn fell.
Yes. Someone else was racing the horse, maybe a jockey, and then the horse fell down.
If you're heading into your foundational boot camp this summer, and congratulations on starting your doctoral program. By the way, this half second of mental whiplash is the exact battleground you're going to be fighting on.
It really is the perfect starting point.
In your previous sessions, you've covered the cognitive revolution, you've looked at memory architecture with signal detection theory, and you've mapped out attention. But today, in session 5, we are diving into language.
We're using Klein's Chapter 8 and your briefing documents to look at what that parse failure reveals about the deepest debates in cognitive science. Because language really is the ultimate proving ground for cognitive psychology.
It's where the biggest, most entrenched theoretical wars get fought out, right?
Absolutely. We are talking about the friction between nativism and empiricism. Are we born with innate, hardwired linguistic rules, or do we construct them entirely through exposure to our environment?
And we are looking at rules versus statistics, too. Does the human mind operate like a pristine logic engine applying strict algebraic rules?
Or does it operate like a massive probability engine weighing statistical likelihoods? We'll examine modular versus interactive processing architectures today as well.
And crucially, because you are training to be experimental psychologists, we are going to look at how methodology dictates theoretical boundaries.
Yes, that is a huge theme for today. We will see how the specific tools we use to measure the mind literally define what we believe the mind is capable of doing.
It's a massive agenda. And honestly, it's a thrilling one because language feels so unbelievably effortless to us. You just open your mouth and syntax falls out.
You don't consciously think about the muscle movements at all.
No, but under the hood, as Klein's chapter points out, it is arguably the most complex behavior on the planet. It involves coordinating breath, the vocal cords, the throat, the mouth, the tongue.
Or in sign languages, incredibly complex high-speed spatial hand movements.
Right. It requires mapping phonemes, which are the elementary acoustic sounds of a language, onto morphemes, the smallest units of meaning, and then stringing those together using syntax, all while integrating pragmatic, real-world context.
It's an absolute miracle of cognitive processing, a miracle that unfolds millisecond by millisecond.
And that temporal reality brings us to the core debate of real-time processing.
Because as we saw with our racing horse, language unfolds sequentially. You do not get the whole sentence handed to you at once like a completed puzzle.
You hear one phone, then the next, one word, then the next.
Exactly. Each incoming word constrains what came before it and predicts what is coming next. So how does the cognitive system handle this when human language is inherently relentlessly ambiguous?
Okay, but let me push back on the premise for a second. If my brain is aggressively predicting words and building structures before a sentence is even finished, isn't that incredibly dangerous?
How do you mean?
Well, if I'm committing to a meaning while you're still speaking, I run the risk of hallucinating conversations that aren't actually happening. Why doesn't my brain just wait?
That is a very logical question.
Why not just hold all the words in a temporary buffer, wait for the period at the end of the sentence, and then safely, perfectly calculate the meaning without ever going down a garden path?
You would think a logical system would do exactly that.
Hmm.
But the brain accepts the risk of prediction because the alternative, waiting for the period at the end of the sentence, would cause a total system crash.
A system crash. Why?
It goes back to the memory architectures you studied in previous sessions. Human working memory is severely bottlenecked.
Oh, right. Baddeley's working memory model.
Exactly. The phonological loop can only hold a few items of acoustic information at a time, and that trace decays in a matter of seconds.
So if I waited for the end of a long, complex sentence before building any semantic structure, the first few words would have literally faded from my memory buffer.
Yes, the words would just evaporate before you could connect them to the end. The brain is forced to trade the risk of occasional errors, like our garden path glitch, for the immense speed and efficiency of building meaning incrementally.
It converts sounds into structural meaning immediately to clear the buffer.
Exactly, word by word, as the acoustic signal is physically hitting the eardrum. But the debate in the 1980s and 90s was about how it builds that structure.
Right, and that brings us to Lynn Fraser and Janet Fodor. In the early 80s, they proposed a very elegant, highly restricted model known as the modular view.
Yes, the garden path model. This ties deeply into Jerry Fodor's broader philosophical thesis about the modularity of mind.
In this view, the parser, the part of your cognitive architecture that assigns grammatical structure, operates like a blindfolded builder, right?
That is a perfect analogy. It is fast, it is mandatory, and crucially, it is informationally encapsulated.
So when a new word comes in, this dedicated syntactic module just grabs the brick and stacks it using the simplest possible rule.
It is completely blind to the outside weather, it's blind to the architectural blueprints, and it doesn't even care what the brick is made of. It builds using only syntax first.
It doesn't care about the real-world meaning of the words yet. It just uses strict heuristics or structural shortcuts.
Yes, and two of the most famous shortcuts are late closure and minimal attachment.
Let's break those down. Late closure dictates that when a new word comes in, the builder just attaches it to the clause they are currently working on. It's the path of least resistance.
So if, say, the sentence, John said he would leave yesterday, the modular parser automatically groups yesterday with the verb leave.
John said that he would leave yesterday.
Right. It doesn't assume John spoke the words yesterday. It just attaches the new temporal adverb to the closest active phrase.
And the second heuristic, minimal attachment, is a strategy of pure parsimony. The parser builds the syntactic tree that requires the absolute fewest structural nodes.
It refuses to build complex architecture unless absolutely forced. And here's the key to the modular view.
Only after this initial purely syntactic structure is built does the rest of the brain get to look at it right.
Exactly. The semantic and pragmatic systems wait their turn. If the meaning-making systems realize the blindfolded builder just constructed something nonsensical, like a racing horse suddenly falling it, then they sound the alarm.
And that triggers a costly, time-consuming structural reanalysis?
Yes. That alarm bell is the glitch we felt at the beginning of the episode.
Okay, so that's the modular view, but then we have the competing framework, the constraint-based view.
Championed by Marielle McDonald, Neil Perlmutter, and Mark Seidenberg in a highly influential 1994 paper.
If the modular view is the blindfolded builder stacking bricks by rigid rules, the constraint-based view is more like a highly communicative team of architects.
A team of architects, engineers, and site managers who are all looking at the blueprints, the materials, the local zoning laws, and the weather forecasts simultaneously, right from day one.
That is exactly the shift in perspective. The constraint-based theories argued that the brain does not have time for a syntax-first, blindfolded pass.
The team of architects is integrating everything in parallel.
The parser uses the specific identity of the words, the statistical frequency with which those words appear in different syntactic structures, the semantic plausibility, everything.
Even the pragmatic, real-world context of the conversation.
It's a massive constraint satisfaction problem. The system throws all these probabilistic weights into a blender, simultaneously.
And it settles on the most likely interpretation given everything available in that exact millisecond.
But that raises a monumental methodological challenge for cognitive psychologists.
Oh, absolutely. If you are claiming that the architects are all talking to each other in parallel within milliseconds of a word being spoken,
Oh.
how do you prove, or rather demonstrate that?
Yeah, you are trying to measure invisible, split-second cognitive commitments inside someone's head. You can't just wait for them to finish the sentence and ask, did you understand that?
Because the process is already over by then. You need a window into the brain as the language is unfolding.
And the breakthroughs in psycholinguistic methodology are what really blew this debate wide open. Let's look at one of the most elegant methods ever designed, the visual world paradigm.
This comes from Michael Tannenhaus, Michael Spivey-Knowlton, Kathleen Eberhard, and Julie Sedovy in a landmark 1995 paper in Science.
I love this study because the setup sounds like a child's game, but the data it produces is staggeringly precise.
It is deceptively simple. You bring a participant into the lab and sit them in front of a table or a screen with real objects on it.
Let's say there's a physical candle, a piece of candy, and a couple of unrelated objects, maybe a shoe and a mug.
You outfit the participant with an eye tracker that continuously measures exactly where their fovea is fixating. It takes a measurement every few milliseconds.
Then you play them a spoken instruction over headphones. Pick up the candle.
Now, let's slow time down. As the acoustic signal for the word candle is literally unfolding in time, the hard K sound, then the short A vowel, then the N consonant. The word isn't finished yet.
It's just con.
At that millisecond, the acoustic input is perfectly ambiguous. It could be candle or it could be candy. What happens to the participant's eyes?
What Tannenhaus and his colleagues documented is that the eyes dart toward the target objects incredibly early.
As soon as the spoken input provides enough acoustic information, the eyes launch a saccade. But crucially, during that ambiguous can phase, the eyes will look at both the candle and the candy.
Wow, so the brain is activating both lexical representations simultaneously based on the unfolding sound.
Exactly. Then, the moment the acoustic signal hits the D in candle versus the D in candy, the eyes lock onto the candle.
And often this happens before the spoken word is even fully finished by the speaker.
The eyes are physically mapping the probabilistic activation of words in the mental lexicon.
It shows that the parser doesn't wait for the word to end, let alone the sentence. It continuously maps unfolding sound onto the visual environment.
But how does this settle the debate between the blindfolded builder and the team of architects?
Well, it provides a massive piece of evidence for the constraint-based team. Because Tannenhaus went a step further. They used sentences with temporary syntactic ambiguities, garden paths, and manipulated the visual display.
Right. If you give a participant a sentence that is syntactically ambiguous, a purely modular blindfolded parser should always build the simplest syntactic tree first, regardless of what is on the table.
It shouldn't care about the visual context at all.
But if you change the visual display to make one linguistic interpretation more plausible than the other, say, by providing two different apples on the table that need to be distinguished, what happens?
The participant's eyes go to the contextually appropriate object immediately. They don't go down the garden path.
The parser is clearly using visual real-world context to resolve linguistic ambiguity on the fly.
The architects are looking at the site conditions and altering the blueprint in real time.
Exactly. The visual context provides an immediate constraint that the linguistic system integrates in parallel. And we see converging evidence for this parallel processing in reading as well.
Oh, right. If you look at Keith Rayner's 1998 synthesis of eye tracking during reading, you realize that reading is not a smooth, continuous sweep of the eyes across the page.
No, we feel like we are just panning a camera smoothly across the text, but physically our eyes are violently jerking around.
Yes, reading consists of fixations where the eye completely stops for about 200 to 250 milliseconds to extract visual information, and saccades, which are rapid ballistic jumps between words.
And you are essentially blind during those saccades. The duration of those fixations and the pattern of regressions where the eyes literally dart backward to reread previous text physically map the cognitive effort of processing.
So when you read our hook sentence, the horse raced past the barn, your eyes are moving forward normally, making standard fixations.
But when you hit the word fell, eye tracking shows a massively extended fixation on that specific word. The brain halts.
And then you see rapid saccadic regressions backward to the word raced to figure out what went wrong. You can literally see the structural reanalysis happening in the physical movements of the eye.
And we can go even deeper than eye movements. We can look straight at the neural electrical activity using event-related potentials, or ERPs.
This is a methodology you will likely encounter in your neuroimaging rotations.
Yes. In 1980, Marta Kutas and Stephen Hilliard identified specific electrical signatures in the brain that correspond to different types of linguistic anomalies.
Let's unpack the ERPs because they are foundational. You put an EEG cap on the participant, measure the voltage changes on the scalp, and look for specific waves.
And the most famous one is the N400.
Right. The N400 is a negative going electrical deflection that peaks exactly 400 milliseconds after you hear or read a word that is semantically unexpected.
A word that doesn't fit the meaning or the pragmatic context of the sentence.
So if I say, I take my coffee with cream and socks.
The word socks fits perfectly syntactically. It's a noun at the end of a prepositional phrase. The blindfolded builder is perfectly happy with it.
But the semantic architects are horrified. And 400 milliseconds later, your brain produces a massive N400 wave.
Precisely. Now contrast that with a different signature, the P600. This is a positive deflection peaking around 600 milliseconds, and it is triggered by syntactic anomalies.
Or the need for structural revision. If you read a sentence with a gross grammatical error, or if you hit a garden path word that forces you to rebuild the syntax, you get a P600.
For a long time, researchers tried to use the timing of these distinct signals to support the modular view.
They hoped to find that the syntactic processing always happened reliably before the semantic processing, right?
Yes, meaning they wanted to see the syntax waves firing at 200 milliseconds and the semantic waves waiting until 400 milliseconds, establishing that the blindfolded builder worked first.
But the decades of data from ERPs show a much more complex, highly interactive picture.
Semantic and syntactic constraints impact processing in overlapping very early time windows.
The temporal precision of ERPs strongly supports the idea that the brain is an interactive constraint satisfaction machine from the earliest moments of perception.
Okay, so we've established that the adult brain is this incredible parallel processing, probabilistic prediction engine. It integrates sound, syntax, meaning, and visual context in milliseconds.
But that brings us to an even bigger mystery. If that is the adult machine, how on earth does a child build it? How do we acquire language in the first place?
Because when you look at what a toddler has to do, from a pure engineering standpoint, it seems logically impossible.
It is arguably the central puzzle of cognitive development. And to understand the modern landscape of this debate, you have to understand Noam Chomsky's legacy.
You cannot study cognitive psychology without grappling with Chomsky.
In 1959, Chomsky published a devastating paradigm-shifting review of B.F. Skinner's book, Verbal Behavior.
Skinner was operating from the peak of the strict behaviorist paradigm. He argued that language was just another operant behavior. It was learned purely through association, reinforcement, and imitation.
A child says cookie, the parent smiles and hands them a cookie. The child learns the word through positive reinforcement.
But Chomsky pointed out that this behaviorist account completely fails to capture the actual nature of human language. Language is not just a massive list of memorized phrases.
It is highly generative. A child can compose a sentence they have never ever heard before in their entire life, and they can do it perfectly.
If a 3-year-old says, "I swimmed in the pool," they absolutely did not imitate that. No adult says swimmed.
The child generated that form by applying an abstract rule.
This is the core insight of generative grammar. Language is a system of abstract rules that allows us to create an infinite number of statements from a finite set of discrete elements.
And this realization led Chomsky to formulate what became known as the poverty of the stimulus argument. This might be the most famous philosophical argument in modern cognitive science.
Let's really break down the poverty of the stimulus because it sounds like an insult to parents, but it's actually a profound observation about data.
The argument is that the input children receive from their environment, the stimulus, is just too poor, too noisy, too sparse to mathematically explain the incredibly complex, nuanced grammar they end up possessing.
Parents don't sit down and teach their toddlers the rules of reduced relative clauses or subjacency constraints. They just talk to them.
And everyday speech is messy. It's full of fragmented sentences, false starts, interruptions, and grammatical errors.
Yet somehow every neurologically typical child in the world seamlessly converges on the highly structured, complex grammar of their native language by age 4.
Therefore, Chomsky argued, the deep structural rules of language cannot merely be learned from the environment. The math doesn't work. The data is too sparse.
So the knowledge must be biologically hardwired into the human brain from birth. We must be born with a universal grammar, a dedicated language acquisition device that already contains the deep structural principles of how human language works.
Experience doesn't build the rules. Experience just flips the specific environmental switches or parameters for English versus Japanese versus Swahili.
This is the strong nativist position. Language isn't learned from scratch, it grows in the mind, much like an organ grows in the body.
And for decades, this nativist framework dominated the field. It felt undeniable.
But the empiricists, the researchers who believe in powerful general-purpose learning mechanisms, did not surrender. They started looking for ways to show that the stimulus wasn't as poor as Chomsky thought.
And in 1996, Jenny Safran, Richard Aslin, and Alyssa Newport published a tiny one-page paper in the journal Science that sent absolute shockwaves through the discipline.
The paper is titled Statistical Learning by 8-Month-Old Infants, and the elegance of the experimental design is matched only by the sheer depth of its theoretical implications.
They wanted to ask a fundamental question. Can infants extract deep structure from language using pure statistics without relying on any innate grammatical rules?
To really appreciate this, we have to imagine the child's perspective. Imagine being dropped into a foreign country where you don't speak a single syllable of the language and everyone speaks at 200 words a minute.
It's just a wall of continuous sound. There are no spaces between spoken words like there are on a printed page. How do you even know where one word stops and another starts?
That is the infant's daily reality. So Safran and her team brought 8-month-old babies into the lab. These infants are barely able to sit up independently, and they are definitely not speaking yet.
They play them a continuous 2-minute audio stream of an artificial, synthesized language. It's a robotic voice just droning out 3-syllable nonsense words strung together with absolutely no pauses, no intonation, no acoustic cues to tell the baby where the word boundaries are.
Just a wall of sound. Bitaku.
For a human adult listener, it sounds like an unbroken stream of maddening babble. But hidden inside that stream is a pure mathematical structure based entirely on transitional probabilities.
The researchers constructed 4 specific 3-syllable non-words. Let's say Bidaku is one word and Padoti is another. They randomly strung these words together to create the 2-minute stream.
Now, let's look at the statistics of that stream. Because Bidaku is a fixed word in this artificial language, if the baby hears the syllable bai, the probability that the very next syllable will be da is 100%.
It is a transitional probability of 1.0. Bi and da are always locked together within the word. But what happens at the boundary between words?
That is the crucial mathematical manipulation. The transitional probability across a word boundary drops significantly.
If a word ends in the syllable ku, the next syllable depends entirely on which of the other 3 words happens to randomly come next in the sequence.
So the transitional probability from ku to the start of the next word might only be 33% or 0.33.
So the rule is simple. Syllables within a word predict each other perfectly. Syllables across word boundaries predict each other poorly.
That's the statistical signature of a boundary. But can an 8-month-old brain calculate that?
After just 2 minutes of listening to this monotone babble, they tested the infants using a looking time paradigm. They played the babies isolated words from the artificial language, like Bidaku.
And then they played them non-words. Now, these non-words weren't totally new sounds. They were syllables from the stream that spanned a word boundary, like dakupa.
This is a brilliant control. The infants had heard the sequence dakupa in the stream just as often as they heard Bidaku, but dakupa spanned a boundary.
And the looking time data demonstrated that the infants clearly distinguished between the words and the non-words. They looked significantly longer at the flashing lights associated with the non-words.
This is a standard infant novelty preference. They recognize the non-words as something strange or novel compared to the cohesive words.
In just 2 minutes of exposure, these 8-month-old brains had calculated the transitional probabilities of the syllables, tracked the statistical regularities, and extracted the word boundaries.
They found the structure hidden in the noise purely through domain general statistical tracking. No innate linguistic rules required, just a powerful, highly sensitive probability engine.
It is a stunning finding. But it's incredibly tempting to look at Safran's data and say, boom, Chomsky was wrong, behaviorism and empiricism win.
And frankly, a lot of people did try to say that when the paper came out. But why is that a massive historical trap? Does statistical learning just destroy the poverty of the stimulus argument?
It is vital for a doctoral student to understand why the answer is a resounding no. Statistical learning does not refute nativism entirely.
It is a brilliant demonstration that some aspects of language acquisition aspects previously thought to require dedicated innate linguistic machinery can actually be accomplished by general statistical learning.
Word segmentation is a huge foundational hurdle, and babies can clear it with statistics. Okay, but if a baby can track probabilities to find words, why doesn't that solve the whole problem? Why does Chomsky survive that?
Because statistical word segmentation is a very, very long way from learning generative grammar. Tracking the localized probability that day follows by does not magically scale up to generate recursive hierarchical syntax.
A statistical tracker looking at adjacent syllables does not explain how a child inherently knows how to form a complex question.
Or how they understand long-distance dependencies in a sentence where the subject and the verb are separated by 10 other words.
What the Saffron study did was force the nativist position to retreat and specify. You can no longer broadly claim that everything about language is innate because the stimulus is too poor.
You have to specify exactly which deep structural properties are innate, like recursion, or the capacity to build hierarchical trees, and concede that the brain's statistical learning capacity handles a vast amount of the heavy lifting at the lower levels.
It redefines the battle lines. It forces both sides to get more precise. And this brings us beautifully to a battleground where this high-level abstract debate between rules and statistics erupted into an all-out, decades-long war.
You are talking about the English past tense.
Yes, over a hyper-specific phenomenon. The English past tense. It is like the entire cognitive science debate compressed into a microcosm of the mind.
The English past tense is uniquely suited for this theoretical war because it has a dual nature. We have regular verbs, which follow a highly predictable generative rule. You add the suffix ed to the stem.
Walk becomes walked, jump becomes jumped, blink becomes blinked.
But we also have irregular verbs,
Mm.
which defy the rule entirely and have idiosyncratic forms. Go becomes went, run becomes ran, catch becomes caught.
And when you watch human children learn this dual system, they do something fascinating. Initially, when they are very young, say around 2 years old, they actually get both right.
They say jumped and they say went. They seem to just be memorizing individual words as isolated chunks.
But then around age 2.5 or 3, they undergo this sudden, seemingly inexplicable regression. They start making overregularization errors.
They start saying goed, comed, runned, catched.
This U-shaped developmental pattern is striking. In 1988, Steven Pinker and Alan Prince published a major paper in the journal Cognition, framing this developmental pattern as undeniable behavioral evidence for a dual system account of language.
In their view, the human mind literally contains two distinct cognitive mechanisms. The overregularization errors are evidence that the child has abstracted an innate symbolic rule, add ed, to make it past tense, and is now aggressively over-applying it to everything.
So you have a formal rule processing system for regular verbs operating alongside a completely separate associative rote memory system for the irregular verbs.
When the memory system fails to retrieve went quickly enough, the rule system kicks in by default and generates goed.
Two distinct systems, a dictionary and a grammar book in the head. But the empiricists, the statistical learning camp, were not going to let that dual system theory stand unchallenged.
Because if language requires explicit symbolic rules, then the empiricist's dream of learning everything through statistical association is dead.
So, in 1986, David Rumelhart and James McClelland published a competing model in the second volume of their legendary parallel distributed processing books. They built a connectionist model, an artificial neural network.
This is a crucial moment in the history of cognitive science. Rumelhart and McClelland wanted to show that you do not need explicit, hard-coded algebraic rules to produce rule-like behavior.
They trained a single distributed neural network by feeding it pairs of present and past tense words. They presented the network with the phones for walk and trained it with go, and trained it to output went.
Wait, let's unpack how it learns, because this is the magic of connectionism. The network has absolutely no rules programmed into it. There is no line of code that says add ed.
There is no separate memory module for irregulars either. It's just a web of artificial neurons connected by numerical weights.
It's like tuning a massive guitar blindly. When it guesses wrong, an algorithm called backpropagation calculates the error and slightly tweaks the weights between the neurons. As it gets exposed to thousands of examples, it slowly adjusts those weights based entirely on the statistical regularities of the input. And what happened when they trained this purely statistical web?
The network learned both the regular and the irregular verbs using the exact same single mechanism.
More importantly, during the training process, the network naturally began to output over-regularization errors.
As the statistical weight of the overwhelming number of regular verbs began to dominate the network, it started producing goad and rund, perfectly mirroring the U-shaped developmental pattern seen in human children.
It did this without any explicit rules or separate memory systems, just connection weights and statistical exposure.
It demonstrated that rule-like behavior doesn't require a rule-making machine. Pinker and Prince, naturally, responded with a blistering 120-page critique of the connectionist network.
They argued that the model was rigged, that it couldn't handle novel words properly, that it relied on an unrealistic training schedule, and that it made bizarre errors that human children never make.
The debate raged for decades, and eventually researchers realized they couldn't resolve it with behavior alone. They started looking for new types of evidence, which led them to neurology.
Yes, Michael Ullman and his colleagues looked at clinical evidence from patients with localized brain damage. They were looking for double dissociations, and they found them.
They found that some patients with damage to specific frontal regions of the brain, like Broca's area, lost the ability to inflect novel verbs. They couldn't apply the ED rule, but they retained their memory for irregulars like went.
Conversely, other patients with damage to the temporal lobe showed the exact opposite pattern. They lost, went, and ran, but could perfectly apply the regular ED rule.
Ullman and the dual system theorists claimed this neurological separation was the absolute smoking gun. Physical, biological evidence of two separate systems in the brain.
That sounds like a checkmate. You have physical damage to one area destroying the rule, and physical damage to another destroying the dictionary.
But the connectionists push back again. They fire up their computers, take a single distributed artificial network, and they virtually lesion it.
They artificially damage different parts of the network's layers, and they found that if you lesion a single network in specific ways, it can produce those exact same double dissociations.
Destroying certain nodes wiped out regulars, while destroying others wiped out irregulars, all within one system.
Which brings us to a foundational lesson for anyone entering experimental psychology. We need to be very clear that the past tense debate does not have a settled winner.
It hasn't been definitively solved, and that lack of resolution teaches us about the inverse problem.
What exactly is the inverse problem?
In cognitive psychology, behavioral output, the data you measure in the lab often underdetermines the underlying cognitive architecture.
Multiple different internal mechanisms can produce the exact same external behavior.
A single distributed connectionist network and a dual system symbolic processor can, under the right conditions, produce the exact same overregularization errors, like goad.
They can even produce similar neurological breakdown patterns. How does a science decide between competing architectures when the behavior isn't enough to distinguish them?
The answer is that you cannot just rely on one behavioral task. You need converging methodologies.
You need developmental data, computational modeling, clinical lesion studies, and advanced neuroimaging, all constraining your theory simultaneously.
So if looking at behavioral errors like GOID can't tell us whether the brain uses one network or two, behavioral psychology hits a wall. We have to look under the hood.
We have to look at the wetware of the physical brain to see how language is actually mapped. And this transitions us beautifully into neurobiology.
Because our understanding of language in the physical brain has undergone its own massive revolution. If you open a dusty old psychology textbook from 20 years ago, you see a very simple, elegant picture.
Broca's area handles language production, and Wernicke's area handles language comprehension.
We must dismantle this classical model right now. It is a profound historical oversimplification.
Paul Broca, in 1861, and Carl Wernicke in 1874 made monumental contributions based on lesion studies of patients who had suffered strokes.
Broca identified the left inferior frontal lobe as crucial for production. Wernicke identified the left posterior superior temporal lobe as crucial for comprehension.
For a century, the field relied on this box and arrow model, two distinct processing boxes connected by a neural cable called the arcuate fasciculus.
It is a very common misconception that this 19th century framework represents the modern neurobiology of language. It does not.
While left hemisphere lateralization is generally true for language in most right-handed people, the modern network models are vastly more complex and distributed.
For instance, look at Peter Hygort's MUC model, published in Trends in Cognitive Sciences in 2005. MUC stands for Memory, Unification, and Control.
Hagor's model shifts us away from localized static boxes toward dynamic functional networks. In this model, memory refers to the mental lexicon, your stored linguistic knowledge of words, their sounds, and their features.
This relies heavily on temporal regions. Unification is the active, real-time binding of those stored words into larger syntactic and semantic structures, the team of architects building the blueprint.
This relies heavily on the inferior frontal regions, including what used to call Broca's area, and control refers to the executive cognitive processes that allow you to use language appropriately in a social context.
Like handling bilingualism and managing turn-taking.
And then you have Hickok and Peoples' 2007 dual stream model, which suggests language processes along two distinct neural pathways.
A dorsal stream mapping sound to articulation and a ventral stream mapping sound to meaning. But the most exciting modern development, I think, comes from how we actually measure the brain today. Let's talk about Evelina Fedorenko's work at MIT.
Fedorenko's research represents a crucial methodological innovation in fMRI studies. For a long time, fMRI studies of language brought dozens of subjects into the scanner, had them do a language task, and then mathematically averaged their brain activity together to find the universal language area.
But human brains vary anatomically. The folds and sulci are like fingerprints. By averaging them together in standard space, you blur the signal.
You make the functional regions look much larger and less specific than they really are.
It's like taking a composite photo of 50 different faces to find the average nose. You end up with a blurry blob instead of a sharp feature.
If I average 30 brains together, I might be mathematically erasing the exact localized language network I'm trying to find. So Fedorenko abandoned group averaging entirely.
Instead, she defines the language network functionally, per individual subject.
Exactly. She puts you in the scanner, has you read real sentences versus acoustic gibberish, and finds the exact specific voxels in your personal brain that light up for language.
She creates a bespoke language map for you. And then once she has your personal map, she asks the critical question, what else does this specific network do? Does it also process music? Does it process math?
And the findings have been remarkably clear. When defined at the individual level, the language network is highly selective. It processes language, period.
It actively ignores math problems. It ignores music listening. It ignores logical reasoning puzzles.
It even ignores theory of mind tasks, where you have to guess what someone else is thinking.
This selectivity is huge because philosophers and scientists have long assumed language is deeply tied to our general intelligence, our ability to do math, or our complex logic.
But Fedorenko's individual subject fMRI work sharpens our understanding. At the neural level, the language network is a dedicated, specialized system. It sits alongside general cognition, but it is not the same thing.
Which naturally brings up a brief detour we need to take before we leave the topic of the brain and thought. If language is separate from general logic, does language dictate thought?
This is linguistic relativity, commonly known as the Whorf hypothesis.
If my language doesn't have a word for a specific shade of blue, am I physically incapable of seeing that color?
For a doctoral level understanding, we have to apply extreme nuance here. The strong version of the Whorf hypothesis, linguistic determinism, the idea that language rigidly dictates your cognitive limits and prevents you from thinking certain thoughts, is widely rejected by modern cognitive science.
You can perceive colors you don't have names for. However, the weak version linguistic relativity is supported by a robust body of cross-linguistic methodologies.
Researchers like Lera Boroditsky have shown that the specific grammatical structures of your native language can subtly but measurably influence how you categorize colors.
And how you conceptualize spatial relations, and how you mentally map time. Language doesn't build the cognitive house, but it certainly influences the interior decorating.
Okay, we've covered real-time processing, we've looked at babies calculating statistics, we've fought the past tense connectionist war, and we've looked at individual subject fMRI.
But now we arrive at what I truly believe is the most consequential part of our entire discussion. This is the methods bridge.
For you, the first-year doctoral student listening to this, the next 10 minutes are the most important methodological discussion of your summer boot camp.
Because if we have all these elegant theories of language, we have to ask a terrifying question. How solid is the statistical foundation of the experiments we use to build them?
We're turning our attention to Tal Yarkoni's 2022 paper in the journal Behavioral and Brain Sciences, titled The Generalizability Crisis.
This paper targets a foundational systemic flaw in how cognitive psychology conducts its statistical inference. The core argument is meticulous, and its implications are quite literally devastating for a massive portion of the published literature in our field.
Let's walk through the logic of this meticulously. When we design an experiment in cognitive psychology, we almost always treat our participants as a random sample.
We test 30 undergrads in our lab, and we use inferential statistics to generalize our findings. We assume those 30 people represent a random sample drawn from the broader population of humanity.
But participants aren't the only thing we sample, are they?
No, they are not. We are also sampling stimuli. We are sampling tasks. We are sampling experimental contexts.
And here is Yarkoni's devastating observation. While we meticulously treat participants as a random effect in our statistical models, we routinely, almost universally, treat the stimuli, the specific words, the specific pictures, the specific sentences we chose to show them as fixed effects.
Okay, before we tell listeners how to fix this, let's look under the hood. What does treating stimuli as a fixed effect actually mean mathematically?
Treating stimuli as a fixed effect is like doing a taste test on 3 specific Granny Smith apples, deciding they are tart, and then publishing a paper claiming all fruit in the universe is tart.
You didn't sample fruit randomly. You sampled 3 specific green apples. What is the statistical consequence of doing that in cognitive psychology?
The consequence is that your math only licenses you to generalize to the exact same stimuli you used. If you treat stimuli as fixed effects, your statistical inference simply does not allow you to generalize to the broader category those stimuli are supposed to represent.
We need a concrete example to make the stakes of this real. Let's co-narrate a hypothetical, very typical cognitive psychology study from your briefing document.
Imagine I am a researcher. I want to demonstrate a grand theory. Semantic relatedness affects human memory. So I design a standard recognition memory study.
I carefully select 50 common English nouns for my study. Words like apple, car, dog, house.
You recruit 20 participants. They study your list of words. Later, you give them a recognition test containing the old words and some new distractor words.
Crucially, some distractors are semantically related to the studied words, like putting cat as a distractor for dog, and some are completely unrelated.
You run your standard statistical analysis, usually in ANOVA. You treat your 20 participants as a random sample, but you treat your 50 chosen nouns as fixed.
And the results come back, and they are beautiful. The semantically related distractors cause significant or more false alarms. My p-value is 0.01. It is statistically significant.
So I draft my manuscript. The title is Semantic Relatedness Impairs Recognition Memory. I sent it to a major journal.
Can I write that paper? Can I ethically make that broad theoretical claim?
According to Yarkoni and the fundamental laws of statistics, no. You cannot. Your statistics do not demonstrate that semantic relatedness affects human memory.
Your statistics demonstrate that semantic relatedness affects memory for those 50 specific nouns you chose. That is the absolute limit of what your math allows you to claim.
Because you did not sample those nouns randomly from the entire universe of nouns, and you did not treat them as a random factor in your model, you have zero statistical basis to say this effect generalizes to any other words.
If you swap your 50 highly concrete nouns for 50 different nouns, maybe less frequent words, or abstract concepts like justice or irony, the effect might completely vanish.
Or it might reverse entirely. Your study provides absolutely no mathematical basis for predicting what will happen. You have generalized wildly beyond your statistical license.
This is terrifying, because essentially every paper I read as an undergrad did exactly this. They tested 20 sentences and made a claim about sentence comprehension. They tested 40 pictures of faces and made a claim about human face perception.
It is a systemic issue. And what is fascinating and somewhat tragic historically is that Yarkoni did not invent this critique.
In 1973, a researcher named Herbert Clark published a paper in the Journal of Verbal Learning and Verbal Behavior titled The Language as Fixed Effect Fallacy.
He made this exact mathematical argument specifically about psycholinguistics. He documented that treating language stimuli as fixed effects produces massively inflated type I error rates. It produces false positives.
1973, that's over 50 years ago. So what happened? Did the field read Clark's paper and immediately change its statistical practices?
The paper was widely read. It is one of the most highly cited papers in psycholinguistics. And yet it was broadly ignored in everyday practice for over 30 years.
Why? Because it was simply too inconvenient.
Because changing how experiments were designed and analyzed was hard. The computational power required for the complex mixed effects models that solve this problem wasn't easily accessible on standard lab computers in the 80s and 90s.
So researchers just kept using an OVS, treating stimuli as fixed and hoping for the best. But now, as computational power is infinite and the replication crisis is looming, Clark's ignored warning has returned to haunt the field.
So, as a doctoral student designing my very first experiments this fall, what should I actually do about this? Because I don't want to publish papers that are statistically invalid. How do I fix the generalizability crisis in my own lab?
There are three practical rules you must integrate into your research workflow immediately. First, before you even collect data, clearly define the exact population you want to generalize to.
I mean, the population of participants and the population of stimuli. If you want to make a claim about spoken English sentences, you cannot just test 5 sentences you wrote yourself over coffee. You have to specify the bounds of your claims.
Okay, define the population of stimuli.
Second, you must sample your stimuli diversely, and you must use mixed effects statistical models that treat both participants and stimuli as random factors simultaneously.
These are sometimes called cross-classified random effects models. The software tools in R and Python to do this are now standard, robust, and widely available. You have no excuse not to use them.
These models account for the variance introduced by the specific words or pictures you chose, preventing you from artificially inflating your confidence in the result.
And the third rule.
Write ruthlessly honest discussion sections. Do not overgeneralize for the sake of a sexier journal publication.
If your effect is statistically constrained to a specific set of highly concrete high-frequency nouns, state that explicitly in your conclusion. Do not write a sweeping, poetic conclusion about the fundamental nature of human memory if your statistics only support a claim about a narrow, highly specific stimulus set.
This ties directly into what we are going to cover in Session 6, the replication crisis.
They are essentially two sides of the exact same coin. The generalizability crisis is the theoretical engine driving much of the replication crisis.
Why do classic studies fail to replicate when another lab tries them? Often, it is because the original finding was highly dependent on the specific fixed stimuli or the specific experimental context of the original lab.
A true scientific finding only earns its generality through repeated testing across varied stimuli, diverse contexts, and different populations. Generality is earned, not granted, by the p-value of a single narrow study.
Okay, we are coming to the end of a truly massive, rigorous deep dive. Let's briefly look back at the incredible terrain we've covered today.
We started with the visual world paradigm, watching a participant's eyes dart to a candle in milliseconds, establishing that sentence processing is highly interactive and parallel, integrating meaning and vision on the fly.
We look at 8-month-old infants acting as brilliant statistical engines, calculating transitional probabilities to extract word boundaries from a wall of Babel, which forced us to dramatically refine Chomsky's nativist claims.
We explored the past tense debate as a prime example of the inverse problem, where behavioral errors like goad and rund can be perfectly explained by both dual system rules and single system connectionist networks, requiring us to look at clinical lesion studies and neurobiology to attempt to pull them apart.
We dismantled the 19th century Broca-Wernicke textbook myth in favor of distributed, functionally specific neural networks.
And we concluded by confronting the sobering reality of the generalizability crisis, learning that our mathematical inferences must respect the way we sample our stimuli, not just our participants.
Looking ahead, Session 6 will tackle reasoning and the replication crisis head-on, building directly on Tal Yarkoni's warnings today.
And Session 7 will bring the poverty of the stimulus debate roaring back to life when we ask whether large language models, LLMs, trained on billions of parameters finally solve Chomsky's problem, or whether they just create entirely new ones.
And a crucial reminder for everyone listening as you prepare for your seminar. This audio deep dive is your learning companion, not a replacement for your assigned texts.
You still need to rigorously read Klein's Chapter 8, the Safran's statistical learning paper, the Tannenhaus visual world study, and Yarkoni's target article before you step into the room.
We'll leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over as you prep. If our standard statistical tools have quietly allowed us to overgeneralize about language for decades, as Clark warned us in 1973,
what other foundational textbook cognitive phenomena, the ones you learned as gospel as an undergrad, might simply be artifacts of the specific 50 words or pictures a researcher happened to choose in 1985? Are we looking at the universal architecture of the human mind, or are we just looking at the architecture of a very specific garden path?